Okay, I just wanted to go over some of the information you just learned in the past few slides about the reservation system and the pattern of the US government breaking their promises. So, after the Indian Removal Act that had been passed by Congress and signed by President Jackson, um, that was the policy of the United States. It was to try and remove Native American tribes from their land. Um, the reservation system was instituted where the government would pick land that was further west, usually the most undesirable pieces of land that did not have resources that the government wanted, and they were also usually much reduced in the amount of land compared to what the Native Americans originally had, and then the government would force tribes to move to those reservations. It was not reservations that the tribe picked, it wasn't land the tribes picked, it was what the government chose for them. So the pattern usually went that the Native American tribes would create or sign a treaty with the government to keep their land. And then when something happened where the government found good resources on that land, like in the case of the Sioux, where they found gold, or because more and more white settlers had moved into that territory to use the land, the government would then break the treaty they had originally signed and tell the Native Americans they had to move off of that land anyway and onto the reservation that the government had created for them. And many of the tribes tried to resist. In the case of the Cherokee, they actually tried to use the US legal system to help them to force the government to recognize the treaty they had signed with the state of Georgia. And even though the Supreme Court agreed with the tribe and said, yes, you have a legal right to keep this land, President Jackson ignored that and went ahead and sent the army to force the Cherokee off their land, which ended up in the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee died. Um, in the case of the Navajo, again, the army was sent to force the Navajo off of their land, and that was called the Navajo Long Walk, where they were forced to move to the reservation the government had set up for them, and hundreds of Navajo also died on that walk. So you might ask, why would the Native Americans even try to make treaties with the government when they could see the pattern? They could see that the government was probably going to break it. Well, they didn't have a lot of other options. At this point in time, the Native Americans just most of the time could not match the firepower or the strength of the United States Army. So when it came down to armed conflicts, most of the time the US Army prevailed. The Native Americans might have a few um, times where they were able to triumph in a few battles, but in the overall war, it was the US government that ended up on top. So a treaty ended up being their best option. If they could get the government to agree to allow them to keep some of their land, they thought, let's try this. Let's hope that this will end conflicts, end the death, and we'll get to keep part of our land. Unfortunately, the US government's policy just kept meaning that they would support white settlers, and they ended up breaking most of those treaties.